4,000 ships. In the single year of 1847, the year the Irish remember as Black 47, almost 4,000 vessels left Irish ports loaded with food, grain, oats, cattle, butter, pork, barley. They sailed from Ballina, from Bantry, from Killala, from Sligo, from Tralee, from the most famine-devastated coastlines in Europe, and they arrived in Bristol, in Liverpool, in Glasgow, in London. They sailed under armed military escort, and while those ships crossed the Irish Sea with their holds full, 400,000 men, women and children starved to death on the docks, in the ditches, and on the roads those ships left behind. This is not a story about a potato. This is a story about what the most powerful empire in human history did, and did not do, when 1 million of its own citizens died of hunger. And it is a story about a word, a single word that Britain, almost 180 years later, has never once used to describe what happened. That word is genocide. To understand how 1 million people starved inside the borders of the wealthiest nation on earth, you have to understand what Ireland was before the first potato turned black in the fields of Wexford in September of 1845. Ireland was not a foreign country. It was, legally and constitutionally, part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. The Acts of Union of 1800 had dissolved the Irish Parliament and absorbed Ireland into Westminster. Irish members sat in the House of Commons. Irish peers sat in the House of Lords. On paper, the 8 million people living on the island of Ireland were British subjects, entitled to the same protections, the same governance, the same consideration as any citizen of Manchester or Edinburgh or London. On paper. In practice, Ireland in 1845 was a colony in all but name. Centuries of conquest, confiscation, and legal subjugation had produced a society fractured along lines that would have been instantly recognizable to anyone studying colonial exploitation anywhere in the world. The penal laws, a system of anti-Catholic legislation that had been enforced for over a century, had stripped the Catholic majority of the right to own land, to vote, to hold office, to practice law, to serve in the military, to teach, and in some cases to speak their own language. By the time Catholic emancipation was partially achieved in 1829, the damage was structural and irreversible. The land of Ireland belonged overwhelmingly to a Protestant Anglo-Irish landlord class. Many of these landlords had never set foot on Irish soil. They lived in London, in Bath, in the English countryside, and they collected rents from an Irish peasantry that farmed their land and survived on what was left after the rents were paid. What was left was the potato. The census of 1841 recorded a population of 124 people. Of those, an estimated 3 million depended almost entirely on the potato for sustenance. Not because the potato was all Ireland could grow. Ireland grew wheat, oats, barley, rye, and raised enormous quantities of cattle, sheep, and pigs. But because the potato was the only crop that could sustain a family on the tiny patches of marginal land that the tenant system left to the poorest class. A single acre of potatoes could feed a family of 6 for a year. No other crop came close. The reliance was not cultural. It was not a matter of taste or tradition. It was the arithmetic of survival under colonial land distribution. And then, in the autumn of 1845, Phytophthora infestans arrived. The blight moved fast. Within weeks, fields that had been green and healthy turned black and rotted. The stench was recorded by observers across the country, a sickly sweet smell of decomposition that hung in the air for miles. The first year was bad, but not catastrophic. Perhaps a third of the crop was lost, under Prime Minister Robert Peel, a Conservative who, whatever his faults, recognized the scale of the emerging disaster. The government took action. Peel secretly purchased £100,000 worth of Indian corn from the United States, established a relief commission, and organized a network of local committees to distribute food. The measures were imperfect. The Indian corn was unfamiliar, hard to grind, and caused severe digestive illness in a population unaccustomed to it. But people ate. People survived. Then, in June of 1846, Peel's government fell. The Whigs came to power under Lord John Russell, and everything changed. The new government was shaped by an ideology so rigid, so absolute in its conviction, that it would prove more lethal than the blight itself. Laissez-faire, the doctrine that the market must be allowed to operate without government interference, was not merely a policy preference for Russell's cabinet. It was a moral philosophy. It was, for men like Charles Edward Trevelyan, the Assistant Secretary to the Treasury, who was placed in charge of all famine relief operations, something very close to a religious belief. The market, in this worldview, was a mechanism of divine providence. To interfere with it, to stop the export of food, to distribute free grain, to intervene in the natural movement of supply and demand, was not just economically foolish. It was morally wrong. It was an act against the will of God, and Trevelyan was the man in charge. In the autumn of 1846, the potato crop failed completely. Not a third, not a half. The entire crop, across virtually the entire island, rotted in the ground. And the Russell government's response was to close the food depots that Peel had established, halt the direct purchase of food for distribution, and replace it with a system of public works. Roads to nowhere. Walls around nothing that would pay wages so low that workers could theoretically purchase food on the open market. Theoretically, because the open market, in the west of Ireland in the winter of 1846, meant food priced for export, guarded for export, and shipped for export, not priced for a starving labourer earning 8 pence a day. The public works became death traps. Men weakened by months of hunger were required to break stones and carry rubble in freezing rain for wages that could not buy enough food to sustain their families. According to the records of the Board of Works, by December of 1846, some 500,000 people were employed on public works schemes across Ireland. The death rate on these sites was staggering. Workers collapsed at their posts. Reports from inspecting officers describe men so emaciated they could not lift a shovel, women carrying baskets of stones with infants strapped to their backs, children of 8 and 9 years old breaking rocks in sleet because their parents were too weak to stand. And the ships kept sailing. This is where the numbers become something more than statistics. This is where the documents turn into an indictment. According to the research of historian Christine Keneally, published in History Ireland in 1997 and based on surviving British customs and shipping records, the food that left Ireland during the famine years was not a trickle. It was a torrent. In 1845, according to Cormac O'Grada's analysis of trade records, 251, 907 quarters of corn, over 26 million bushels, were exported from Ireland to Britain. In 1846, 480, 827 pigs, and 186, 483 head of cattle were shipped out. Between 1846 and 1850, over 3 million live animals were exported from Ireland, more than the number of human beings who emigrated. In the first 9 months of 1847 alone, 822, 681 gallons of butter were exported from Ireland to England. Butter, while children died of starvation within sight of the creameries that produced it. The food left under guard. Keneally documented that exports departed from the most famine-stricken ports, Killala, Kilrush, Bantry, Dingle, Westport, under military escort, because the starving population had, on occasion, attempted to stop the carts and the ships. The British Army, deployed in Ireland in increasing numbers throughout the famine years, was used not to distribute food, but to protect its removal. According to Board of Guardians minute books from the Kilrush Union in County Clare, relief officials wrote to Dublin Castle in January of 1847 requesting additional troops, not to help feed the dying, but to ensure that grain shipments left the local harbour unmolested. And through all of this, the administrators spoke, and what they said was written down. Charles Trevelyan, the man responsible for managing the relief of a famine that was killing thousands every week, wrote in a letter to Lord Monteagle in October of 1846 that the judgment of God sent the calamity to teach the Irish a lesson, that calamity must not be too much mitigated. He wrote this while the second and total failure of the potato crop was already underway. He wrote this while the workhouses of Skibbereen and Cork and Galway were turning away the dying for lack of space. He wrote it, and then he continued to manage the relief, which is to say, to manage its limitation. Trevelyan was not an outlier. The language that surrounded the famine in official and semi-official British discourse reveals something that historians have debated for generations, but that the documents themselves make difficult to euphemize. The Times of London, the most influential newspaper in the British Empire, published an editorial in 1847 that called the potato blight a blessing, arguing that when the Irish ceased to be potato eaters, they would be forced to become industrious, carnivorous, and civilized. The Economist published a piece in 1848 stating that it would be wrong to intervene because doing so would prevent the natural corrective forces of the market from restructuring Irish society along more productive lines. Nassau Senior, a professor of political economy at Oxford who advised the government on Irish policy, was reported by Benjamin Jowett to have said that he feared the famine would not kill more than 1 million people, and that would scarcely be enough to do any good. Read that sentence again. A man advising Her Majesty's government on policy expressed concern that the death toll might be insufficient for his economic purposes. And in the midst of this, in the winter and spring of 1847, the worst months of the worst year, the Russell government made a decision that, more than any other single act, crystallized the relationship between ideology and death. They closed the public works. They replaced them with soup kitchens, a program that, while it lasted, was the single most effective relief measure of the entire famine, feeding up to 3 million people a day at its peak in the summer of 1847. And then, in September of 1847, they closed the soup kitchens too, after barely 6 months. The replacement was the amended Poor Law, which transferred the entire financial burden of famine relief to Irish ratepayers and Irish landlords through the Poor Law unions. The same landlords who were themselves going bankrupt. The same ratepayers who were themselves starving. But the amended Poor Law contained something else. Something that would become one of the most devastating instruments of the famine. It was called the Gregory Clause, named after William Henry Gregory, a Member of Parliament for Dublin. The clause stipulated that no person holding more than a quarter-acre of land was eligible for relief. A quarter-acre, not 20 acres, not 10, a quarter of 1 acre. A plot roughly the size of a tennis court. Any tenant who wanted to enter a workhouse, who wanted to receive so much as a bowl of soup from the state, had first to surrender virtually all of their land to their landlord. The Gregory Clause transformed the famine from a natural disaster deepened by policy failure into an engine of dispossession. Landlords who wanted to consolidate their estates and clear their land of smallholders, and many did, now had a mechanism. The famine did the starving. The law did the clearing. Between 1849 and 1854, an estimated 500,000 people were formally evicted from their holdings. The actual number was almost certainly higher because many families surrendered their land and left before the eviction process began, and those voluntary departures were not recorded. The workhouses they entered, if they could get in, were not refuges. They were, by 1847, places of mass death. The Skibbereen workhouse, built to hold 800 people, recorded over 1,300 inmates by January of 1847, with dozens dying every week. The Kilrush Union Workhouse was so overwhelmed that the Board of Guardians' minute books record a decision to stop admitting women with children unless the children were orphans. The logic was explicit. The workhouse could not feed everyone, so it would feed those who had already lost their parents. In Ballinrobe, County Mayo, the workhouse burial records show that in a single week in March of 1847, 47 people died within its walls. Many of the dead were children under 5. The census of 1851 would later reveal that the cohort of children under 5 years old had suffered the most catastrophic decline of any age group in the country. A finding that the census commissioners themselves described as reflecting the particular vulnerability of the youngest to famine conditions, and the ships kept sailing. Now, the word. The United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide was adopted in December of 1948, almost exactly 100 years after Black 47. Article 2 of that convention defines genocide as acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. The acts include killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm, and deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. The debate among historians centers almost entirely on one element of that definition: intent. Cormac O'Grada, one of the most respected economic historians of the famine, has argued that genocide includes murderous intent. And it must be said that not even the most bigoted and racist commentators of the day sought the extermination of the Irish. He argues that the British response was shaped by incompetence, ideological rigidity, and callous indifference, but not by a deliberate plan to kill. He has stated that no academic historian continues to take the claim of genocide seriously, and that a case of criminal neglect is far easier to sustain than one of genocide. But others read the same documents and reach a different conclusion. In 1996, the state of New Jersey included the Irish famine in the Holocaust and genocide curriculum of its secondary schools. The New Jersey Holocaust Commission requested expert opinions, and 2 legal scholars, Charles Rice of Notre Dame and Francis Boyle of the University of Illinois, concluded that the British government had deliberately pursued a policy aimed at destroying the Irish people, and that, under a retrospective application of the 1948 Convention, the policy of mass starvation amounted to genocide. Their analysis focused not on a single decree ordering extermination, but on the cumulative weight of decisions: the refusal to stop exports, the closing of relief programs, the Gregory Clause, the deployment of military force to protect food shipments rather than to feed the starving. Christine Keneally, whose research on food exports during the famine remains the most comprehensive analysis of the shipping records, has argued that the question of intent cannot be separated from the question of knowledge. The British government knew people were dying. The British government knew food was leaving the country. The British government had the military and logistical capacity to stop the exports and redirect the food. It chose not to. At what point, Keneally asks, does a sustained policy choice that you know will result in mass death become distinguishable from intent? Nat Hill, Director of Research at Genocide Watch, has stated that while the famine may not fit perfectly into the legal and political definitions of genocide, it should be given equal consideration in history as an egregious crime against humanity. And then there is the testimony of the administrators themselves. Because the debate about intent becomes considerably more complicated when you read what the people in charge actually wrote. Trevelyan, again, the man running relief operations, wrote in his 1848 book, The Irish Crisis, published while people were still dying, that the matter is one in which the natural and just course is attended with so much hardship, that the best that can be done is to mitigate as far as possible the present suffering and to endeavour to reconcile the people to the course which, after the most attentive consideration, appears to be the only safe one. He described the famine as a mechanism of social reform, a painful but ultimately beneficial process that would modernise Ireland by eliminating the smallholding class that he considered backward. He was not speaking in private. He published this. The Census Commissioners of 1851, in their official report on the demographic catastrophe, wrote that, although the population has been diminished in so remarkable a manner by famine, disease and emigration, the results of the Irish census are, on the whole, satisfactory, demonstrating as they do the general advancement of the country. Satisfactory. A population decline of 6 million people. And they called it satisfactory. The question that the genocide debate forces is not whether Trevelyan personally wanted every Irish person to die. He clearly did not. The question is whether a system of governance that knew its policies were producing mass death, that had the power to change course, that articulated its reasons for not changing course in terms that explicitly described the dying as beneficial to its long-term objectives, whether that system, viewed as a whole, demonstrated an intent that the 1948 Convention would recognize. And if that question remains unresolved among historians, and it does, then perhaps the more revealing question is what happened afterward. What happened afterward is that Britain said almost nothing for 150 years. No formal inquiry, no commission, no parliamentary investigation into the conduct of Russell's government or Trevelyan's administration, no official accounting of the dead, no reparations, no acknowledgment that the policies might have been not genocidal, not criminal, not even mistaken, but simply, plainly, wrong. Then, in 1997, something happened. Tony Blair, the newly elected Labour Prime Minister, issued what was widely reported as the first British apology for the famine. At a commemoration event in County Cork, the actor Gabriel Byrne, because Blair himself was not present, read aloud a statement. The statement acknowledged that those who governed in London at the time failed their people through standing by, while a crop failure turned into a massive human tragedy. It acknowledged that 1 million people should have died in what was then part of the richest and most powerful nation in the world is something that still causes pain. It did not use the word genocide. It did not use the word apology. It did not, in fact, accept responsibility. It described the deaths as something that causes pain. In the passive voice, pain experienced, not pain inflicted. But even that cautious, hedged, carefully worded statement turned out to be less than it appeared. In 2021, documents released from the British National Archives revealed what had happened behind the scenes. Blair had not written the statement. Blair had not approved the statement. Blair could not be reached by his aides at the time it needed to be sent. His principal private secretary, John Holmes, approved it on his own initiative. In an internal memo, Holmes described the statement as something that fell well short of an apology and was no more than a statement of fact. He wrote to Blair afterward, "I hope this does not cause you any problems. It should go down well with the Irish, and I cannot see anyone here or in Northern Ireland seriously objecting." That was the British government's engagement with the deaths of 1 million of its own citizens, a statement the Prime Minister never read, approved by a civil servant who considered it harmless, delivered by an actor because the Prime Minister had something else to do, and the word genocide was never spoken, not in the statement. Not in any official British document before or since, not in Parliament, not in any government communication, not once. In 2023, Ireland's population, the combined population of the Republic and Northern Ireland, was approximately 7 million. The pre-famine population in 1841 was 2 million. 182 years later, the island of Ireland has still not recovered the population it had before the famine. No other country in Europe experienced a comparable demographic collapse. No other former colonial possession in the Western world has a lower population today than it had in the 1840s. The demographic wound is still open. The census proves it every decade. There is a sculpture in Marisk, County Mayo, at the foot of Croagh Patrick, overlooking the Atlantic. It was designed by the Irish artist John Behan. It is a bronze coffin ship, one of those vessels that carried the desperate and the dying across the ocean to Liverpool, to Boston, to Quebec, to Grosse Ile, and the rigging of the ship is made of human skeletons. Skeletal figures climb the masts, hang from the ropes, cling to the hull. It is not subtle. It is not meant to be. And in Middleton, County Cork, there is another sculpture. It was unveiled in 2017. It is called Kindred Spirits. It consists of 9 giant stainless steel eagle feathers, each over 20 feet tall, arranged in a circle like a bowl. It commemorates the donation made in 1847 by the Choctaw Nation, a people who had themselves been subjected to the Trail of Tears just 16 years earlier, who sent $170 to Irish famine relief. $170 from a people who had almost nothing, who knew what it meant to be starved and marched and dispossessed by an empire that considered them disposable. The Choctaw recognized what had happened in Ireland. They did not debate terminology. They sent money. 4,000 ships sailed from Ireland in 1847 with their holds full of food. Not one of them was stopped. Not one cargo was redirected. Not one barrel of oats. Not one firkin of butter. Not one head of cattle was seized by the government and given to the starving. The military that escorted those ships could have fed the people instead. It did not. The Parliament that debated Irish affairs every session could have passed a single act prohibiting the export of food from a country where people were eating grass and bark and the flesh of dead animals found in ditches. It did not. And the word that describes what happens when a government knowingly permits the conditions that destroy a people. That word has existed in international law since 1948. It has been applied to Rwanda. It has been applied to Bosnia. It has been applied to Armenia after a century of Turkish denial. It has been debated, argued, dissected, and defined. But when it comes to Ireland, the nation that ruled Ireland, that collected its taxes, that commanded its military, that exported its food, that administered its death, that nation has never once, in any official capacity, at any level of government, in any document, statement, speech, or parliamentary record, used the word genocide to describe what happened between 1845 and 1852. 4,000 ships left Ireland full in 1847, and the word is still empty.